I'm going to start there with hello. So hello. All right. So I'm going to talk about a body of work that began in Detroit. And first I have to say that I am not from Detroit, right? I am honored and privileged to do my work there, but I cannot claim that space and I cannot claim that experience. I do want to acknowledge right off the top that this work began by listening, and there's no better person to listen to on this than Halima Cassels, somebody who has led this journey. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit, very quickly, about the organization that I'm at, because I'm at one of those organizations that has the privilege and benefit of selecting no particular audience served on their application form, right? It covers a lot of sins. It keeps in place a lot of structural inequality, as we know. But I work at an organization that says that we develop creative people and creative places and creative economy for a strong and resilient Michigan. It also means that we have reframed, not as an arts organization, but around this idea that we are for social profit, because all too often we tell people what we are not in the lane of nonprofit, and we don't tell them what we are for. We do not tell them about what we are hoping to create. And I have to believe that it is for social profit, that it is inherently about social impact, it is inherently about a social justice process that actually matters when we talk about difference. And so that is kind of how I came to this work. Filled with questions, wanting to ask a lot of questions, but asking a lot of questions takes up a lot of space. So learning how to be quiet and listen was hard for me. I'm a theater major, we don't do that. Right? I then became a policy person. I learned a little bit better, right? But one of the things that really struck me as we started to say that we worked in this space of empowering creative people was that how do I know what they want and need? How do I actually hold myself accountable to that work if I'm really doing it well? And so there's a really big piece of this that is missing, which is how do we actually claim that we first and foremost need to be listeners in these spaces when we have privilege and power? And that led to this work, this very beautiful work, born of Detroit activists and organizers, not thinking necessarily first and foremost about culture, but thinking about the rapacious development that is taking place in the city and how they were not going to have it done to them without them at the table. How could they demand equity at tables around real estate development in a city that had for a long time this idea that any development was good development, which happens so many places. So they actually thought about the way that culture could show up in that space, right? The way that cultural power could actually hold people accountable to equitable development, because there were many conferences and convenings, these things that we take for granted as institutional practices, that it is our right to convene in another place as a kind of exotic sort of tourism in that space in order to hold conferences and convenings, right, where we could form communities of interest and communities of practice on various subjects, and we ourselves could be enlightened in those spaces while actually not affecting or pretending to not affect anything in the place we were, right? And so they shifted this. They put the onus on organizers who were coming into their town to say, what are you doing for us to make us better after your presence is gone, right? And so evolving out of that is this idea of cultural community benefits. It is strange for us in the arts to think we have power, that we have purchasing power, that we have privilege in society. And yet we are surrounded by communities that are often in less off positions than ourselves in terms of their economics, in terms of their social, in terms of their health outcomes, in terms of their well-being. So we have a right and a duty and a care to actually reach out and extend to that. And so this work really came out of that and then into something as beautiful as REMAP and ArtChangeUS, where it could really flourish and thrive and find a natural partner who was really wanting to take this step into how do we change institutional practices. Because if we can't become aware of our norms, then we can't actually affect those changes. And so the very first one, which seems really obvious, right? So I'm gonna walk you through these principles, and then I'm gonna tell you that we actually developed a toolkit, because these principles are gonna seem large and overwhelming and daunting, right? Build inclusive organizations. How many people have tried to build an inclusive organization in the last minute or the last year, right? It's deserving of its own toolkit. And all too often what we find, especially at organizations like mine, is we have these conversations about how we're interested in it. We're really interested in it. We really believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Of course our values are there, right? But taking the step to make sure that it is actually not just in our program staff, but it's in our leadership, and it's in our boards, and it's not just the person who does the engagement and outreach work, is something altogether different. So we have to figure out how we take these steps and how we stumble when we take them, and we ask for permission, and we say we're sorry when we fail. We need to figure out how to do all those things. We have to think about how we honor Indigenous people and lands, right? We cannot continue to contribute to the Indigenous erasure that happens in this country. We cannot pretend that colonialism was something that happened in the past, as if it doesn't have persistent and systemic problems today. And we can't do it once, and we can't do it transactionally. This has to be about the long-term journeys we take when we just simply say difference matters. We want to be in relationship with you. We want to be in partnership with you. We want to step beside you. We want to lean our ideas up next to your ideas so that we can sort of figure out what is collectively best as we move forward. And then we want to commit to doing cultural equity. This is a practice, right? It requires a lot of sort of sub-strands and sub-themes, and it looks a lot like saying build authentic relationships. Something that we learned in kindergarten but forgot in high school, and certainly did not take forward in college when we started thinking about how we compete rather than collaborate, right? But it's also about how we uplift authentic narratives, how we don't replace, how I don't become the spokesperson for this movement. This is not my movement. I am an editor at best, right? I am a listener at best. I maybe am sometimes a translator. But there are people whose authentic narratives take place in this work, and we cannot forget them. And we have to recruit and invest. This is about money. This is about resources on the table. Eventually, always, and it can be evidence-based, right? So when we think about the fourth principle, it is around creating local economic benefits, right? It's everything from the printing and the photocopying and the paper and the catering. It's also how we pay our artists, and can we just pay our artists? I mean, for a sector that has flipped so powerfully towards evidence-based, data-driven work, the BLS website exists. Bureau of Labor Statistics exists. We know what a living wage calculator is. We can use it to pay our artists. Pay our artist. I'm an artist, you can tell, right? Like, I want to be paid. And then finally, contribute to field-wide change, right? For every person who helped me sit at that table and listen, make a table for somebody else, make a place for somebody else, walk this journey with somebody else. And we do that by being transparent. Publish your budgets. We publish 990s, this isn't hard, right? Make your budgets fun and accountable. Brainstorm your budget. Somebody in your convening, if you've put the right advisors around you, can tell you who the local person is that you need to pay for your catering, for your food, for your printing. And then put that out there as a resource guide for others, right? We've got to get used to thinking about how we become transparent in order to be radically inclusive. Gather feedback, right? This is everything from quantitative work and qualitative work to storytelling work, right? Because that feedback is about how you listen and then internalize the change and then live it the next day. And with each one of these steps, we get a little bit better, right? You can't do it all at once. You can't do any of these principles all at once, but all of you, I guarantee, are in the position to do something tomorrow on one of these. And that's what it takes. That's what's missing from the way that we talk about this work, is it's both urgent, because we got to take that first step, but it is the distance. Like, it took us a year in my organizations to start talking about values-based budgeting. And it was the easiest place for us to start, because then our mission is economic development, right? Much harder for us to do board transition, but we're working on that. So I don't even come here today as somebody who has or is at an organization that has all of the answers, right? I promised that I had more questions and I had more journeying than I ever will in terms of thinking about how do I do this work in an ongoing way. But I will say the other part about this is you have to do it with some safe space, some brave space, and a lot of self-care. You cannot do visionary work on empty. You cannot do that in your organizations. You cannot do that in your personal life. So how we sort of think about the space we need to be in order to be abundant as we do this work, to be joyful as we do this work, to be brave as we do this work, is really what this toolkit is and really what it's about. And it's always in draft form, right? So we're going to put it out and we're going to want feedback about what should be next, what should be better, what should have been different the first time around, right? But it is a resource for our field, because if we don't change our practices, we cannot change where we are heading. So this is the crux of it. Community benefits agreements, whether we're talking about in cultural institutions or cultural community benefits, are not a panacea. And this is the work coming out of MIT and Kat Sisek, also working with a crew of amazing Detroit justice workers through the Detroit Narrative Agency project. The thing is, it is no substitute really for the deep down governance work that has to be done. Like, it is policy, it is context, it is political. So, what we have is an imperfect thing, that we can make compacts with each other. We can make agreements with each other. We can hold ourselves accountable in lieu of these systems not being perfect yet, but only so that we are taking the steps to work towards those more perfect systems. And that's what we have with community benefits agreements. That's what we have with cultural community benefits agreements. And so finally, hopefully hitting either email inboxes soon, the website soon, some of you in person today, is a toolkit that begins to unpack these terms, right? That has some self-reflection exercises, that gives you the space, if you've never heard the term brave space, to know what that means, right? For those of you who really, really like things to be research-based, we have links, we have sources. For those of you that are like, I need to be able to facilitate this tomorrow, we have some group exercises, including how to brainstorm a budget with community members, right? So really for us, this has been about how we begin in our stumbling, fledgling ways at Creative Many to contribute to this dialogue, to hold ourselves accountable, to listen to our artists and people who we are thankful for every day, allow us to make mistakes with them. And then finally, to try and do that brave thing of offering it up to the field saying, it's not perfect, but we're going to be here. So thank you.